Hello everyone. Ancient Egypt. For dozens and dozens of generations, for thousands of years, the gods of Egypt were worshipped all along the Nile River. The most spectacular temples and monuments ever seen, the most sumptuous tombs, were dedicated to them, their architecture and their walls impregnated in symbols, myths, and religious fervor. There were hundreds of these gods, most of them only known locally. Others so successful that they were famous and worshipped north to south for millennia. Some rose to prominence along the centuries, while many more were forgotten, or their cult merged with other deities. But after thousands of years of reigning alone over the hearts and souls of the Egyptians, the gods of Egypt began to decline. Invaders took control of the country. The Persians from the east, the Greeks from the north, the Romans from the west. Old Egyptian deities were not forgotten, not yet, but new cults were introduced into Egypt, and the rulers of the country were no longer of Egyptian blood. This lasted for several more centuries. Year after year, the dream of seeing Egypt rise again as a great power one day faded. Had the power of the gods disappeared, or had they abandoned Egypt? No one knew. But it happened one day that a new cult appeared in foreign provinces, provinces that once were part of the Egyptian Empire. And the new faith spread to every corner of the Roman Empire, of which Egypt was now a part of. This new single god and his followers claimed that all the gods that had been worshipped before were fake idols and shall be rejected, their temples destroyed or converted into temples of the new faith, and their myth forgotten. The new believers, who called themselves Christians, overwhelmed Egypt. Their ranks grew each day, and the Egyptians recanted the faith of their ancestors. Like the dying stars from a distant galaxy, the temples closed one after the other, and one day the last of these stars, to the south of Egypt, on the island of Philae, fluttered and vanished. The gods of Egypt had lost their last believers. The domination of the Christians over Egypt didn't last long. Other invaders, the Arabs, and yet another single god religion took control of the land. The old gods of Egypt remained asleep. They were apparently powerless, or uninterested in our world, maybe. Again, generations passed. The temples were covered in sand, or sometimes dismantled, and the memory of the gods kept fading away. There was no one left to read and say their names out loud from the walls of the temples, preventing them from existing. The knowledge of the sacred writing was forgotten, and so were the myths and tales that once dominated Egypt. Centuries passed, until monuments were unearthed, studied, the language of hieroglyphs rediscovered, and with it, the myths were deciphered again in their original language. Tonight, we're going to wake up the gods of Egypt once more, to invoke their memory and relive some of the myths and stories that were told for thousands of years across one of the oldest civilizations in the world. So once again we have a long journey ahead, and for tonight we are installed in a camp on the bank of the Nile after a warm day, and only the soft sounds of the wind in the palm trees, the lapping of the Nile's waters, the smell of lotus flowers and hibiscus surround us. I recommend that you adopt a comfortable position. You can sit or lie down. You can make yourself some tea or hot chocolate, or you can close your eyes at any time, because you can easily follow just by listening and letting your mind wander. You will be able to return another time if you fall asleep. There are timestamps in the first comment pinned under the video for this. Together with the timestamps, you will find links to streaming services where you can also listen to my stories, including the last one about Norse mythology, and dozens more, and a link to my Patreon page. If you wish to contribute to my Patreon, you are most welcome. It helps keep this channel free of video ads, and you get downloads, audio or video, surveys, updates about what I'm working on, and you can also listen to the stories as podcasts. Now let's finish our preparation before the first story. Take a deep breath in and out, in and out. Pay attention to the tension in your body, especially in your shoulders, so that you can slowly and gently release it. Then in your arms, your hands, legs, feet, and it begins right now with the Osiris myth. In ancient times, long before the grandfathers of our grandfathers were born, and even before the first pharaohs ruled over the entire valley of the Nile, Osiris was the king of Egypt. He was married to his sister Isis, who was the sweetest, bravest, and most devoted wife. But he had a rival, his brother Set. Osiris had been granted the valley and the delta of the Nile, green and fertile lands, where game was plentiful, crops grew fast, and his subjects lived in prosperity. Set had been given the desert, east and west of the Nile, a desolated expanse of rock and sand, burning hot in the day and freezing cold at night, where his only subjects were wild beasts like hyenas and scorpions. Set resented his brother Osiris and was a mean-spirited, violent king who had resolved to find no rest until he would have taken his brother's land. One day, he managed to capture Osiris and kill him. But he knew Isis was also a powerful magician and could make him relieve. So he dismembered his brother's body and scattered the pieces across Egypt. His rival out of the way, Set took the throne of Egypt and began a reign of terror. Isis had gone into hiding and clung to her last hope. She started a quest to discover and reassemble her husband's body. Tirelessly, she traveled north to south, from the delta to the cataracts of the Nile, and east to west, from the Red Sea to the Libyan desert, in search of the pieces of Osiris' corpse. Eventually, she could gather them all and began to restore Osiris' wholeness. This kind of funerary process had never been done before, and Isis asked for the help of deities sympathetic to Osiris and herself, like her sister Nephthys and the master of the underworld, Anubis, the god with the jackal head. Together they embalmed Osiris and wrapped the body in white, immaculate linen. Isis knew powerful magic, but she could not bring back people from the dead, and the soul of Osiris was now prisoner between worlds, unable to start its journey to the underworld because he hadn't been buried properly. The restoration of the body's integrity had called back the soul from limbo, but for Osiris to fully travel to the underworld, his ceremonial burial had to take place. And Isis was alone and could not organize it. So she hid the body and decided to wait for better days. But before hiding her husband's embalmed body, she could call back the spirit for a short time. And she did, reviving Osiris for one last night. That night, an heir was conceived by the two spouses, the god Horus. Pregnant with Horus, Isis had to hide again, because Set the usurper was still the master of Egypt, and actively searched for her, having heard that she had retrieved the pieces of Osiris' body. For years, Isis had to move from secluded place to secluded place to give birth and then raise her son, Horus. She turned into the best mother the world had ever seen, an epitome of maternal devotion, sometimes brave and ferocious to protect her child, sometimes sweet and caring to console him or heal him with her magic. Mother and son escaped hostile creatures and the envoys of Set for years, and Horus grew up, becoming stronger and braver each day. The child became an adolescent, and finally a young man, but not an ordinary young man. He was a son of two gods and a god himself. His father ruled on land, so he became a god of the sky. And like his animal, the falcon, he could fly high and nothing could escape his sight. His eyes became identified with the sun and the moon, which at the time shined equally. Set, Isis, Horus, and all other gods knew that one day the son of Osiris and his uncle would fight for the kingship. Horus had been conceived and raised to avenge his father and end the unjust rule of Set. The struggle between uncle and nephew lasted several years. Several times they fought, but none of them could get the upper hand. In one of these battles, Set wounded Horus severely. He teared out one of Horus' eyes. Horus could escape this time, and the god Thoth healed him, but he could only partially restore the eye. And from this moment on, the wounded eye, the one associated with the moon, shined less bright than the sun, the other eye. Finally, after several more fights, Horus vanquished Set. The assembly of gods acknowledged Horus as the winner, the rightful successor to Osiris on the throne of Egypt, and Set was sent back to the desolation of the desert. The principle of justice, Ma'at, was restored, and Horus ascended to the throne. As son and heir, he could perform the funerary rites for his father. The hidden body was finally buried, perfectly preserved by the rite of embalmment. Horus was now the king of the living, and Osiris became the king of the dead. The realm of the dead, the Duat, was now his. But he was a benevolent king, responsible for the regeneration of life on earth. He would now help the souls of the deceased reborn in the afterlife and be responsible for the annual growth of crops. Horus stayed on the throne for a long time, several human lives, and he was succeeded by gods and spirits, until the first pharaohs of Egypt's historical lineage of kings, which made every new pharaoh a successor to Horus. This myth was probably the most influential and popular along Egyptian history. It is also one of the oldest. It reached its basic form before the 24th century BC, more than 4,000 years ago. And it lasted for so long as a narrative that different anecdotes, different turns of events occurred in it, depending on the periods and the places. In some accounts, the fight between Horus and Set is not physical, it is legal, in front of the assembly of gods. The tradition that Set had cut Osiris' body into multiple parts and scattered them is a late addition from the New Kingdom, the last period when ancient Egypt was unified and strong, and also the one when it expanded the most beyond the valley of the Nile. You know that traditionally the history of ancient Egypt is cut into several periods, unifications and periods of decay or foreign invasions. After a pre-dynastic period, there is the Old Kingdom, the time when the oldest large monuments were built, like the pyramids of Saqqara or Giza. After centuries of stability, an intermediate period began, succeeded by the Middle Kingdom. Then another intermediate period, and the New Kingdom, which left some of the most famous temples, tombs, like that of Tutankhamun, some of the most famous pharaohs too, the Ramesses, Akhenaten, Queen Hatshepsut. At the time, the capital had moved south to Thebes, on the site of present-day Luxor. Along the New Kingdom, the one cult that experienced a spectacular rise and became the most important in Egypt was that of Amun, a local god that became so important over time because the successive pharaohs covered its temples in favors and privileges that it even absorbed other deities. The cult of Amun came to claim that other gods were aspects of Amun. Amun would have been the hidden force behind all things. We will review later at least a dozen of these gods, of the most famous figures, but they are only the successful ones that were particularly popular across Egypt or powerful around an important city. Apart from them, there were dozens more deities that protected a region or were associated with a concept or a natural phenomenon, because the ancient Egyptians came up with a deity for each of these things. The gods and the myth associated with them were a way to appropriate and maybe tame all these phenomena they observed, from the growth of plants, the annual floodings of the Nile, or the existence of animals, to the succession of days and nights, or the biggest mystery of all, what happened after death. Over several thousand years, they created many versions of this myth, generally incompatible between them, and featuring different gods depending on the regions and the periods. An example of that is the variety of myth of creation. So let's take a look at these other stories. The first origin story of the world, and the oldest one known, was from the city of Hermopolis, near the frontier between Upper Egypt, the south, and Lower Egypt, the north. It went like this. Before the world began, there was a primordial abyss filled with water, and this abyss had no limits. It extended infinitely in every direction. It had no bottom. But no one could have witnessed this, because it was before life appeared. The qualities of this primordial water were represented by a set of 8 gods, 4 male and 4 female, forming couples. Nu and his female counterpart, Naunet, were the water itself. He and Hauhet were the water's infinite extent. Kek and Kauket were the darkness within it. Amen and Amaunet were its hidden and unknowable nature. Together they formed the octoed, or eightfold, and the males were represented with frog heads, whereas females were represented with the heads of snakes. One day, the two groups of male and female deities converged, and their encounter resulted in a great upheaval. A mound, shaped as a pyramid, emerged from the waters. From it emerged the sun, which rose into the sky, and for the first time this world in creation received light. All other gods and living beings also emerged from the primordial energy liberated by the encounter of the 8 gods. I told you this origin story is the oldest that we know of. It is referred to in the pyramid texts, which are the oldest ancient Egyptian funerary texts that we know of. They are dated from the Old Kingdom, and they were carved onto the walls of pyramids and sarcophagi from the 24th century BC, some 45 centuries ago. But this origin story was not the only one. In Heliopolis, near the delta of the Nile, the creation was attributed to Atum, a deity that existed in the waters of this abyss of Nu, as an inert potential being. For eons, Atum was just a thought, a potential waiting to happen. But one day, he began to form, and the mound, the primordial pyramid, emerged from the waters. Atum was self-engendered, the first and last god to have this power, and he could change aspects and separate them from himself, creating new elements. First, he gave rise to Shu, the air god, and his sister, Tefnut. Tefnut was the void among the waters where the world would form. Shu and Tefnut coupled and produced 2 children, the earth god, Geb, and the sky goddess, Nut. Together, the siblings that represented the earth and the sky defined the limits of the world. Geb and Nut together gave rise to 4 children, the forces of life. Osiris, the god of fertility and regeneration. Isis, goddess of motherhood, Set, the god of chaos, and Nephthys, the female complement of Set. As you understand it, this was a possible prequel to the Osiris myth that I told you earlier, with the rivalry of Osiris and Set. So, in total, the primordial being, Atom, had two children, the air and the void. Together they had two more, the earth and the sky, who had four children, the components of life. This makes a total of 9 gods, 9 deities that are collectively called the Ennead and were worshipped in Heliopolis. In this theology, Atom was often represented as the sun, and the 8 other gods were as much individual gods as they were different aspects of Atom. Not far from Heliopolis was Memphis, a city that remained important throughout ancient Egyptian history and was the capital during the Old Kingdom. The most important deity worshipped in Memphis was Ptah, the patron god of craftsmen. Ptah represented the ability to envision a product and shape raw materials to create it. And the theology developed in Memphis saw the creation of the world as an intellectual act rather than a physical phenomenon. It also starts with the same watery abyss. And in this abyss, Nu, existed the force represented by Ptah, the force to envision and assemble, to create new elements and new beings. So Atom, the primordial being of the Ennead that we just discussed, did not self-engender in this theology. It was created by the thought of Ptah. And it became real when Ptah said his name by the power of the word. By speaking names for his ideas, Ptah produced the gods and all other things. He was the true creator of the world. I told you earlier that Thebes became the capital of unified Egypt in the New Kingdom. And with the preeminence of Thebes, its local god, Amun, became the supreme god of the Egyptian pantheon. So, unsurprisingly, the narrative that developed in Thebes made Amun the transcendent deity, the one responsible for the creation of the world. You remember that in the first story of creation I told you, the one from Hermopolis, there were 8 gods, the Ogdoad, and Amun was one of them. Not to be confused with the Ennead from Heliopolis, the 9 gods including Atom and his offspring. Amun was one of the primordial gods of the Ogdoad, the gods represented with frog and snake heads. But in the Theban myth of creation, he was considered the most important one, the other 7 being only lesser aspects of him. According to this narrative, Amun was in fact separate from the world, contrary to all other gods. He was the one who initiated creation, but his true nature was inaccessible. And invisible to other gods themselves. The priests of Ammon created another level, a sort of meta-theology that put Ammon at the head of all gods, and the tradition that Thebes was the location where the primordial mound had emerged also spread to all of Egypt during the New Kingdom. As the prominent god, Ammon merged with Ra, the sun god, which is why he was sometimes called Ammon-Ra. This variety of gods and the fluctuations of their fame and following along Egyptian history can be a bit confusing. So let's take a look at some of the most prominent gods. We already talked about Osiris, the god of the underworld. He was generally represented as a mummified king, wearing wrappings that left only the green skin of his hands and face visible. But Osiris was seen as benevolent, despite reigning on the realm of the dead. He embodied the cycle of life and also symbolized resurrection and the cycle of Nile floods that Egypt relied on to irrigate and fertilize the land. He was the first to be mummified according to the legend, and he represented the transition to life after death that all Egyptians had to get ready for. All human cultures had burial ceremonies and practices. The Egyptians were obviously not the only ones to try to preserve the physical bodies after death, but they were certainly the only ones who made it on such a scale and for so long. Only the elite was mummified very cautiously and buried with treasures. But even common people had a quick mummification process. Their bodies were placed in natron, a mixture of sodium carbonate that the Egyptians called nether. Natron absorbs water and acts as a drying agent. Another advantage is that when it is exposed to moisture, its pH increases, it becomes more acidic, and this creates a hostile environment for bacteria. The Egyptians ignored the specifics of how it worked chemically, but they knew that it was a very efficient and naturally occurring preservative for bodies. In embalmment scenes, Osiris was generally represented with Isis, his wife, and her sister, Nephthys. Nephthys was essentially pictured as an assistant in mummification, as she had assisted Isis in the Osiris myth, and didn't have other aspects or qualities associated to her. But Isis became the most important goddess in the Egyptian pantheon, and her cult expanded well beyond Egypt in the Greco-Roman period. She was an embodiment of maternal care and the traditional virtues of a wife and a mother in ancient Egypt. She was identified with Aphrodite, the Greek goddess of love and beauty, and her cult reached as far west as Great Britain and as far east as Afghanistan before the expansion of Christianity. She was one of the last, if not the last, of Egyptian deities to lose her following. Their son was Horus, depicted as a falcon or a man with a falcon head. Horus was a sky god, associated with war and hunting. As we have seen, his eyes were also associated with the sun and the moon. This is where it gets a bit complicated, because there were other sun gods. Re or Ra was another major one, and he was depicted with the head of a hawk. It was believed that Ra sailed across the sky in a boat each day, and when he reached the limit of the sky to the west at sunset, he began a passage through the underworld. Each night, he had to face a snake god, Apopis, and defeat him in order to cross the underworld and rise again on the following day. Depending on the periods and places, Ra and Horus were sometimes merged. This was not such a problem because in the Egyptian pantheon, the gods were more associated with concepts than physical objects. Ra was the sun at noon, not the sun in general. There was another god for the rising sun. The way Egyptians saw this pantheon, at least their priests and theologians, was certainly much less on the nose than the depictions suggest. We see humanoid beings with animal heads on the walls of monuments and tombs, but they should be seen as symbols, possible appearances that allowed for the myths and beliefs to be told. Religion was much more complex and probably spiritual than just a colorful pantheon with gods assigned an area of responsibility. The concept that many gods were not individual beings, but rather different aspects of the same primordial force, was widespread, as we have seen with the myth of creation. And in that sense, the deities were mediators, ways for humans to approach and worship much broader forces that they were aware they couldn't comprehend. So the figure of Ra, which had a cult centered on the city of Heliopolis, easily morphed and merged with others, like Horus or Ammon in the New Kingdom. Set or Seth was the closest thing to a villain in the Egyptian pantheon, but one whose existence was unavoidable and who should be worshipped and appeased too. He was the god of violence, chaos, deserts and storms. He was generally depicted as an animal or a human with the head of an animal that could be a thin dog or a kind of fox. But many scholars believe that this animal was not specific and was more like a mythical composite of different canids. Yet another one, we already mentioned, was Ptah, the god of craftsmen and builders. Ptah was mainly worshipped at Memphis as the head of a triad of gods. There were also his wife, Sekhmet, the lion-headed goddess, and their son, Nefertum. Nefertum was a minor figure, but Sekhmet was a goddess of war known for being the destroyer of the enemies of the sun god, Ra. Her husband was a creative force, and she represented a more violent and destructive side. She was also associated with disease and medicine. Another goddess, but with a softer side, was Hathor, who was generally represented as a cow, or a woman with the head of a cow, or in a more human form, as a woman with cow's ears. Hathor embodied motherhood and fertility. She protected women in childbirth and was also invoked in funerary ceremonies as the entity who welcomed the dead to their travel to the underworld. We will see later what this travel was thought to be like with another story. She was sometimes presented as the mother or the consort of the sky god Horus and the sun god Ra, and this made her a symbolic mother of their representatives on earth, the pharaohs. So once again you see that the functions, the frontiers between deities could be blurred. She could sometimes replace Isis. In fact, it is more the opposite that happened. Hathor apparently came from other similar cattle goddesses that were portrayed very early in pre-dynastic times, as early as the 4th millennium BC. Then she became one of the most important Egyptian goddesses in the Old Kingdom, thanks to the patronage of pharaohs. She always remained important, but during the New Kingdom, pharaohs tended to replace her with Isis as their favorite motherly feminine figure. And after the end of the New Kingdom, she was increasingly overshadowed by Isis. Another well-known figure was Anubis, the jackal god. Osiris rose to prominence as the lord of the underworld during the Old Kingdom. Before that, Anubis was considered the principal god of the dead. He didn't disappear. He was just assigned a lesser role, and also lasted to the end of ancient Egyptian religion as the patron god of embalmers. You probably also know Thoth, the god of writing and wisdom. He could be depicted as a baboon, or as an ibis, or a man with the head of an ibis. Thoth was believed to possess extraordinary knowledge of magic and secrets. He invented language and the hieroglyphic script. As such, he was the scribe and advisor to the gods, and the patron god of scribes. Another famous goddess was Bastet, the cat goddess. She is generally seen as a seated domestic cat, or a woman with the head of a cat, sometimes wearing rings in her nose or ears. But this is a late depiction of Bastet, because originally she was a lioness goddess, like Sekhmet. The two figures came to represent two aspects of the same goddess, with Sekhmet representing the more powerful and ferocious aspect, whereas Bastet became a gentler aspect. She was increasingly depicted as a domestic cat, and also in the later period of ancient Egypt, she was presented as a daughter of Ra and Isis, or the consort of Ptah, replacing Sekhmet. As she lost the more aggressive aspects of her image, her reputation, she became a protector of homes against diseases or evil spirits, and of pregnancy, maybe because of the association with cats that were very popular in Egypt and protected houses from rodents. And finally, a word about Amun, the most important god of the New Kingdom. As we saw before, Amun is an ancient god. He was one among the 8 original deities worshipped in Hermopolis. His cult traveled south to Thebes, which was a secondary city in the Old and Middle Kingdoms, until the 16th century BC. Egypt had been occupied by a dynasty of foreign rulers known as the Hyksos, who had come from the east. Nominally, the Hyksos had replaced native Egyptian pharaohs during the intermediate period between the Middle and New Kingdoms, but their power was stronger in the north, in Lower Egypt. In the provinces of Upper Egypt, local rulers had a certain independence. This intermediate period didn't suspend Egyptian culture at all. Life went on, just with foreign kings and a political fragmentation. At the end of this intermediate period, the rulers of Thebes rebelled against the Hyksos and eventually reconquered and reunified Egypt, starting the new period of resurgence and expansion called the New Kingdom. The capital of Egypt was moved to the south, to Thebes, and Amun was credited for this victory. In the following 250 years, Egypt reached unprecedented levels of wealth and influence. This is when the tombs of the Valley of the Kings and the Valley of the Queens were dug. The temple of Karnak in modern Luxor turned into a gigantic complex. And alongside the pharaohs, the clergy of Amun was a force to be reckoned with. They owned land, they collected taxes, they had a huge political power, and the fervor around the cult of Amun spread well beyond Thebes, to the point that Amun absorbed other deities like Ra, and the narrative that made him the creator of the world and the supreme god overshadowed other cults. Amun is everywhere in the tombs and the temples of this period, and before him, no other god or clergy had reached such power. This may be one of the reasons why a heretic pharaoh, Akhenaten, appeared during the New Kingdom. A political struggle against the clergy of Amun could have taken place. I already told you in a previous story about Amarna, the new capital that Akhenaten built to replace Thebes, but ultimately Akhenaten failed, and immediately after his death, the capital returned to Thebes with his successor, the young pharaoh Tutankhamun, famous for the discovery of his tomb in the Valley of the Kings. Akhenaten tried to replace old gods, mainly Amun, with the Aten, the disk of the sun. The Aten was not an invention, it was the name given to the disk and an aspect of Ra, the sun god. What Akhenaten did was make it the only focus of official worship during his reign. And he claimed that all other gods were just aspects of the Aten. Outside Amarna, this religious revolution didn't really work. People kept following the old ways, and the power of the clergy of Amun was only shaken for a few years. After the death of Akhenaten, when the capital he had built was abandoned, Amun recovered his importance. Traces from the heretic pharaoh were eliminated from official records, and his capital completely abandoned. But let's leave the New Kingdom and make a big jump to the past for another old myth and another story. The reign of the sun god Ra. In the mythic past, after the creation, the sun god Ra dwelled on earth as the king of the gods and of humans. This was a time of wealth, unity, and stability, a golden age that would never come back later. But this wonderful era only lasted because Ra protected the world from disorder and enforced math, justice, and balance. He once had to face several gods who defied his authority and destroyed them with the help of Thoth, the god of wisdom. Another time, an extension of himself, the Eye of Ra, turned against him. The Eye of Ra could act independently from him and take the form of a goddess. It happened that the Eye goddess became angry with Ra and ran away from him, away from Egypt. Ra was weakened by her absence and had to send Thoth to retrieve her. The weakening of Ra soon affected the land. Water began to miss, crops no longer grew, and the light was dimmed to the point that the day resembled a night. Thoth could convince the Eye to return to Egypt, and her return restored order and renewed life. The waters of the Nile rose and inundated the land, making it fertile again. Since then, every year, the rise of the star Thothis in the night sky, a visible aspect of the Eye of Ra, signals the return of the annual flood. But it was said that keeping the world orderly was a fight of every moment. The gods had turned against Ra, so had a part of him, the Eye. And now humanity too was plotting rebellion. Ra discovered it and sent his Eye to punish the man. The Eye slayed many people, so many that humanity may soon disappear. Ra didn't want his creation to end, but the Eye, this part of him that was always ready for violence, wouldn't stop. So he had beer dyed in red to resemble blood, and he had the beer spread over the land. The Eye Goddess thought it was blood, and she drank it, soon becoming drunk, which made her stop her massacre. Humanity was spared, but Ra was now weary of ruling on earth. So he withdrew into the sky, and he began his daily journeys through the sky and the underworld, starting the alternance of days and nights as he appeared and disappeared. As Ra abandoned the earth, so did the other gods, and the age of gods came to an end, leaving the earth to humans. A new cycle began, the one of our times. And gods now only intervene punctually, their most important manifestation being the presence and reign of successive pharaohs. As the gods abandoned the world, the survivors among humans were dismayed, and they turned against those who had conspired against Ra. And so appeared war on earth, an absurd but unavoidable struggle to restore justice, and more dead started their journey to the underworld. Speaking of death, what the Egyptians thought of what happened after death. Over time they elaborated another myth for this, and this will be our last story of the night. The best known Egyptian funerary text is called the Book of the Dead. It was used for 15 centuries. There were many different versions, and they were personalized. They appeared in the New Kingdom and lasted to the 1st century BC. This book was placed in the coffin or the burial chamber of the deceased. It contained the magic spells that would guide their journey to the Duat, the underworld, where they would be judged. But the first funerary texts appeared long before and revealed the way the ancient Egyptians saw the afterlife. The oldest ones are the pyramid texts that we talked about already. They appeared on the walls of pyramids and tombs in the Old Kingdom and kept being carved or painted until the New Kingdom. They contained rituals to be performed and spells and powers that would help the dead into their new life, to move, to feed, to get protection. The notion that the dead would be judged by the gods already existed, if deemed worthy, or at least sufficiently helped by the texts. They would be allowed to mix with gods and live with them. These inscriptions were increasingly put on the coffins or on the sarcophagus in the Middle Kingdom. But it is in the New Kingdom that the precise description of the journey of the dead that we know of was fixed. Before the deceased faced their judgment in front of Osiris and other gods, they had to travel to the underworld and pass a series of gates, caverns, and mounds, guarded by supernatural creatures. These monsters had to be pacified by reciting the appropriate spells from the Book of the Dead. Once pacified, they would no longer be a threat, and could even extend their protection to the dead. After this, another breed of creatures waited for the deceased, slaughterers that would kill the unrighteous even before they reached Osiris. Fortunately, the Book of the Dead contained spells to escape their attention. After passing these obstacles, the time for judgment arrived. The deceased would be judged in the weighing of the heart ritual. They were led by the god Anubis into the presence of Osiris. The dead made a confession. They swore they had not committed any sin, and after that, their hearts were weighed on a pair of scales against the goddess Maat, who embodied truth and justice. Maat appeared represented as a feather, an ostrich feather. If the hearts were heavier, out of balance with Maat, a fearsome creature called Amit stood ready to eat the souls and condemned the dead to a second death that would end their hopes of eternal life. There was no hell to fear. The punishment for not being worthy of Maat was disappearance, and this punishment could be inflicted by the living, because some forms of death, like decapitation, would kill people twice immediately, and not even give them a chance to appear for judgment. But if the weighing of the heart was successful, Anubis would guide the person to Osiris, who would allow entrance in the afterlife. We have reached the end of our journey for tonight. I will now leave you in the company of the sweet sounds of our camp on the Nile's bank. I'll be back soon for another story. And in the meantime, sleep well. Sweet dreams.